Car model years start a few months before the actual year, meaning a 1994 Mustang probably started hitting dealerships in 1993. Here's what else also came out in 1993 and 1994. For example, these are some of the new movies that came out in 1993. Jurassic Park, Free Willy, Mrs. Doubtfire. For computer folks, the Intel processor came out. The first Intel processor. Not the i5, not the dual core, the first processor came out. A large pizza was 10 bucks. Heck, going to Pizza Hut was still a reward. And Sony Walkmans, you know, the ones that played the cassette, those were only $29. The 90s were just 10 years ago, right? If you're looking into an SN95 Mustang or a New Age Mustang, you must watch this. Because frankly, these cars are not new anymore. In this video, I'll be talking about maintenance, because more likely than not, the next Mustang you are looking to was used as disposable transportation. Whether it was an enthusiast hot rod or just a fun car to drive to work, SN95 Mustangs are in the valley of their lives. They're just old cars now. They're not desirable classics. Great for gearheads like you and me, but they're generally uninteresting to the general public. Wait about 15 to 20 years before they actually catch on again. Want to know why? Well, I have a video explaining this too. It's over there somewhere. Anyways, let's start with the basics. And one thing I'm just gonna point out right from the get-go, that this is my personal advice. I've had SN95 and New Age Mustang since about 2007, so I'm a car enthusiast. I'm not a mechanic. I've simply owned one of these things for like forever, so whenever it comes to working on your own car, sure, you can listen to talking heads like me on YouTube, but also do your own research too. There's still a wealth of Facebook groups, and if you might remember this, online forums that will explain a majority of fixes. Fluids. I have a firm belief that whatever was maintained by the previous owner should be taken with a grain of salt. Meaning, as soon as you pick up one of these Mustangs, do a full fluid change. What does that mean? Let's start into it. A real basic one is to change the oil, and use a good oil. For my Roush, I've been using Motorcraft's 520 semi-synthetic blend. I've even had my oil analyzed by Blackstone. Their recommendation was honestly, keep doing what I'm doing. I typically do spirited driving along with normal driving. If you have a purpose-built engine, make sure to consult the engine builder on what's recommended. Change the transmission fluid. Note, I specifically say change it, not flush it. Most SN95 Mustangs are probably well past 100,000 miles, some even to 200,000 miles. At that point, I would just change the fluid and have a small cash reserve in case the transmission was on its last legs. I know for my T45 transmission in my Roush, heck, it was shifting fine, but I wanted to have the extra insurance that I knew I had new fluid in it versus fluid that's been in there since the Bush administration, because that's a long time ago. Change the rear differential fluid. This fluid is going to most likely smell terrible since it is so rarely changed. I think, for example, in my Roush, it was never once touched until I decided just to change it myself. If you have a Mustang GT or any Mustang with an 8.8 rear axle, make sure to get the friction modifier, so the limited slip differential keeps working. It actually requires that fluid. Change the coolant, especially if it's murky brown. Again, I would for sure start with just changing the fluid versus a full flush. Sometimes in a car's cooling system, there might be a bunch of crud, a bunch of rust just kind of floating around in there. Start simple, change the fluid. Fluid should not be brown, it should be green or whatever the manual is recommending. And last, and very much overlooked, change the brake fluid. Every used Mustang I've bought had squishy brakes, notably from very old brake fluid. Brake fluid absorbs moisture, and considering that some of these Mustangs are almost 30 years old, now is a great time to bleed the brakes for better stopping power. Okay, great. So what else? Next is spark plugs. If you have a virtually stock Mustang, the Motorcraft plugs and coils are what you want. There's aftermarket parts that might be tempting. More often than not, Motorcraft OEM parts will do fine. This is an odd case where both the cheap parts aren't good and neither are the big name brands such as MSD a worthwhile upgrade. Unless you have a crazy ground up purpose-built engine, replace all of your spark plugs and coils with Motorcraft OEM and ensure they are properly gapped. While we're there, I also recommend sea-foaming the car. Even my Roush, which only had 72,000 miles on it in 2015, and it's like at 120,000 miles now, it belched a ton of white smoke from carbon deposits. I noticed that the already healthy engine seemed to be even more rev happy. Post seafoam, by the way, make sure to change that engine oil. After all this, make sure to wear rubber. I mean, change the rubber. Besides the tires, cars have numerous rubber components. So let's talk about them. Like any old car, rubber tends to wear out, notably the coolant hoses. The coolant hoses, since they have been on the car and are always getting hot, cold, they tend to wear out after a while, especially after a couple of decades. If the coolant hose is looking gorge and are super squishy, they are super ready to be changed. Since the coolant has to be changed, this is a great time to go ahead and do that now. Want to change more? Change the rubber brake lines for stainless steel, since we're all going to be changing the brake fluid. Since you're already replacing the brake hoses, might as well swap in some speed bleeders onto the calipers to make it a one-person brake bleeding job. Hungry for more? Replace the front sway bar bushings and sway bar bushing end links. I've installed a lot of parts over the years, and replacing these small rubber components on the front sway bar is probably one of the cheapest yet most notable upgrades. Maintenance tends to pile upon each other. So okay, great. These are all maintenance fixes, but what about an actual must fix? Here's an important one. And comment down below if you know this one. It's about the 99 to 2001 PI engine. Comment down below what you think. Now, the new age Mustangs from 99 to 2001 have what's called a plastic crossover for the coolant pipe on the upper intake. That is a mouthful. Due to the heat of coolant, this crossover pipe can break and crack, which means, guess what? Your coolant is now spewing out of the car and it's going to overheat. At this point, a vast majority of Mustangs have already had it replaced. Unsure? Here's what the underhood of my Roush looks like, which was an early 2001 car. I actually have documentation that this car had the plastic crossover pipe for a majority of its life. And I believe it was around 2014 that the previous owner, since he so rarely drove the car, he actually then finally got it replaced because then it started to crack. Now, that's the thing, 2014, the car finally cracked, and mine was a low mileage example. If you don't have a low mileage example, at this point, go ahead and fix it. As you can see, the coolant crossover pipe is now metal, which is the updated upper intake. Luckily, since the PI intake is so common, these can be purchased at virtually any auto parts store, or even picked up from a junkyard. If you're still looking at any of these early 4.6 PI cars, always make sure it already has this crucial fix done. This is a bigger fix, but a good start to auto repair. Grab a Haynes manual, grab some new gaskets, fluids, and some tools. Great, so we have all this maintenance done. Now what? It's time for upgrades. Since this generation Mustang is in the middle of its value valley, it's a great time to go parts shopping both online and offline. In the next few videos, I'm going to recommend some decent aftermarket parts and also what to completely avoid.